Welcome to video 2. In this video, we will be talking about using inversions within the basic progressions which have been introduced to you in the last video. Let's start with the 151 progression. Right now, we are in the key of C. What you see here is a 151 progression written out in a grand staff to be played on the piano. So in this configuration, you have one bass note written for the bass clef staff to be played by the left hand. The other three chord tones is written in the treble clef staff to be played by the right hand. This is how you will have to write out your chords for your assignment. It is important to note that the inversion of chords depend on your bass note and not the bottom note of your right hand chords. The reason why this chord here, chord 5, is inverted into B, D, G instead of G, B, D, which is the root of that chord, is because you want to choose a chord position in the right hand in which the notes can move smoothly from one chord to another. Imagine if this is instead GBD, then your right hand has to move a distance between the C chord and the G chord, and that will not sound very smooth at all. So you would want to avoid that and find positions in which the notes move by steps or small leaps. So notice that the chords in this progression here are in root position. Let's take a listen. Now, to make things interesting and so that we can get the bass line here moving a little bit differently, we can use the first inversion for the 5 chord, which you can see over here. Instead of a G, the bass is now a B. The B is a third of the 5 chord. So that's the 1561 progression if in any instance you want to move the bass line from C to B and back to C. Let's listen to this. Very commonly in classical music, you will find dominant 7th chord used instead of just chord 5. In the key of C, the dominant 7th chord comprises of the notes G, B, D, and F. You can use all the notes of the dominant 7th chord when writing it out, even using all 4 notes in the right hand, or you can choose to omit one note, which is the 5th note, that is D right here. This is what I've done. Try not to leave out the 1st, 3rd, or the 7th note of the dominant 7th chord, because if you do so, you will lose the identity of the dominant 7th chord. So this is how the progression 1571 can look like. Just like the 1561 progression, the dominant 7 when inverted in its first inversion becomes a 565 chord. This is how it looks like. The B again becomes the new bass note, and the rest of the chord tones are on top in the treble clef staff. Let's listen to these progressions. So far, we've only applied the first inversion chord on the 5 chord in a 151 progression. But you can actually use the first inversion chord on almost any chord, depending on the direction of your music and your musical aesthetics. So first inversions in chord progressions are generally freely used. Here's another example of using the first inversion chord on another basic progression, that is 1-4-5-1 progression. As you can see here, we have the 1-4-5-1 progression all in root position. And you see the bass going from C, F, G, and C. Another alternative to the 1-4-5-1 progression is to use the first inversion on the 4 chord to make it a 1-4-6-5-1 progression like this. The chord 4 is now in the first inversion, and we have chord 4, 6. The bass of this chord is now an A instead of an F. Therefore, the bass line has now been changed to C, A, G, and C. We will now listen to these progressions. Unlike the first inversion chords, which can be freely used, using the second inversion chords is different. You will have to be very careful because there are specific ways of using second inversion chords to be stylistically accurate of emulating classical music. There are three types of second inversion or 6/4 chords. They are the passing 6/4, pedal 6/4, and the cadential 6/4. Let us look at the passing 6/4 chord. A passing 6/4 chord is a second inversion chord which normally occurs in between of two chords of the same kind, one in root position and the other in first inversion. We can use a passing 6/4 chord on a 1-5-1 progression. What happens is that we get an ascending bass line in this case. Let me walk you through this. So we have a 1-5-1 chord progression whereby the first chord is in root position. If we invert the 5 chord in the second position, what we will get is the bass note, which is the third of the chord, that is a D. And then moving on to the next chord 1, we invert this to the first inversion as a 1-6, and the E is now the bass note. So the result is a smooth ascending bass line going from C, D, and E. Now, the same thing applies when you do this to a 5-7 chord or dominant 7th chord, such that the dominant 7th chord becomes a 5-4-3. You'll get the same ascending bass line with the 7th sounded in the 5-4-3 chord, the 7th being an F over here. Let's listen to the 1-5-4-3-1-6 progression. If you like, you can also use this progression the other way around so that you can get a descending bass line. The 1-6 will go before the 6/4 chord, and the 1 in root position will come after the 6/4 chord. Another application of the passing 6/4 chord is when you have a 4 chord and you want to expand it such that you also get a descending bass line underneath. For example, here we have the progression 4, 5, and 1. With this 4 chord here, we can expand it by using the passing 6/4 chord. Let me show you over here. This is our progression 4-5-1. Right here, 4-5-1. This is the passing chord, a 1-6-4 chord. And before this 1-6-4 chord is the 4 chord in first inversion. Here then we have the progression 4-6-1-6-4, 4-5-1. This is how it sounds like. The second type of 6/4 chord is called the pedal 6/4. It is usually used on a 1 chord or a 5 chord. And if you have instances of 1-4-1 progression or 5-1-5 progression, you might want to use the pedal 6/4 chord. The effect of the pedal 6/4 chord is such that you get the same bass note throughout 3 consecutive chords. Let me walk you through the formation of this progression. We have the chord 1 in root position, and then we progress to the 4th chord in second inversion. This means that we have the 5th of the 4th chord, which is a C, in the bass. Then we move on back to chord 1 in root position again. Same thing applies with the 5-1-5 progression. We have the 5th chord in root position, and then we move on to chord 1 in second inversion, where we will have the G in the bass, and then we move back to chord 5 in root position. So this is how it sounds like. It's called the pedal 6/4 because the name comes out from organ literature, where you'll have in such music the pedal, literally the pedal of the organ, holding down a note in the bass while the other things happen on top. So that name comes out from that piece of history. Now the last kind of 6/4 chord that you will learn here is called the cadential 6/4. The cadential 6/4 is a kind of chord in which you insert into an existing progression, usually in preparation of a perfect cadence. Here is a 5/1 progression, and as you already know, this is a perfect cadence. Whenever you have the 5/1 progression, you can use this opportunity to insert a cadential 6/4 chord. This is how it looks like. Here is a cadential 6/4 chord. You should look at the cadential 6/4 chord as a decoration of the 5 chord. The cadential 6/4 chord is always a second inversion of the 1 chord, or 1/6/4, inserted before the 5 chord. Again, let me walk through the process with you. The 5th of the 1 chord is a G, which is why we have the G in the bass. Then we move on to the 5 chord, which also has a G in the bass. Finally, we end on chord 1. So this is how the progression sounds like. I'm sure that you hear that commonly used in classical music. Make sure that when you are doing this, the chords in the right hand are moving smoothly such that they move by steps. Now, there is another precaution that you should take when applying the cadential 6/4 progression. You need to make sure that the cadential 6/4 is placed on a strong beat and is as long as the dominant chord. Instead of doing this is what you should do. This is because this is how the cadential 6/4 is stylistically used in classical music, and we want to follow that. So in summary, we've learned to use the first inversion chord on a 1/5/1 progression, 1/5/7/1 progression, and 1/4/5/1 progression. We've learned to use 3 types of second inversion chords called the passing 6/4, the pedal 6/4, and cadential 6/4. This is the end of the lesson in this video. In the next video, you will be introduced to sequential progressions.